A strange morning at Little Italy Market. On the west side of Chicago, Little Italy is a lively slice of the city that wakes up each dawn with the smells of espresso and fresh bread drifting out through windows. You'd expect to find nothing but bustle and laughter winding through the vendor stalls. On a September morning in 2014, though, something felt very wrong, like the city itself was holding its breath. Harold Hal Mason, a 58-year-old veteran and lifelong Chicagoan, walked his sanitation route as he did every weekday. Hal, sturdy and gray-bearded, was a familiar sight in the neighborhood. He took pride in keeping the streets clean and chatting up bakers, baristas, and street musicians along his route. That Tuesday, his boots splashed through last night's drizzle as he waved to early risers opening shop fronts. But when he got to the block that always overflowed with discarded pizza boxes and the aromatic leftovers from trattorias, he hesitated. For 2 mornings straight, Hal and his team had noticed weirdly heavy trash bags, heavier even than the bulk from a good weekend's restaurant rush. At first, he shrugged it off as a new vendor pitching out leftovers, but today, something seemed off. The bags weren't just heavy, they were oddly warm in patches, and they reeked, not the way old meat from an Italian sausage joint should, but with a sharp, sickly sweetness he couldn't place. A flicker of unease ran down Hal's spine. He reached down to hoist one of the bags, grunting as it slipped from his gloved grip and split against a curb. Out tumbled a slick, sauce-covered hunk of meat, big, pale-fleshed, absolutely out of place. In his younger days, Hal had done 2 tours in Iraq as a medic. He'd seen things he'd rather not remember, and training had tuned his senses to abnormal danger. Staring at that chunk of meat scattered on the concrete, that old instinct kicked in. The color, density, and shape. It didn't look anything like pork, beef, or lamb. It certainly wasn't a slab of ham. Hal froze, head spinning with memories he thought he'd buried. No one else seemed to notice. A chef bustled by on his way to unlock his kitchen. The world kept moving, but Hal knew in his gut something was wrong. He looked twice at the piece on the ground and swore under his breath. He'd recognize that particular structure anywhere. As absurd as it sounded, it looked a whole lot like a human thigh. Logic screamed at him to dismiss the notion. This was the Little Italy Market, not a crime thriller. But experience shouted louder. He called his supervisor over. Together, the men prodded the bag open, revealing more sauce-drenched pieces packed in foil and plastic. Flies had started to gather. A torn bit of cloth with an unfamiliar floral pattern poked out from beneath another hunk. Maybe a kitchen rag, maybe not. Senses on high alert, Hal pulled out his phone and dialed 911, just as a shiver of revulsion ran through his frame. The operator hardly believed his claim. Who would? But within minutes, red and blue lights painted the damp street. Crime scene tape fluttered. Police and forensics units descended. Cops fanned out, questioning grocers and waiters. Meanwhile, Hal backed away, fighting the urge to be sick, and watched the place he'd always called home transform, in an instant, from a picture of urban comfort to a scene from a nightmare. He stood silent amid the chaos, every sound now thudding in his ears, the hum of squad car radios, hollered questions from rookie cops, and angry confusion from the vendors. For Hal, the routine morning shift had split cleanly into a before and after. In Little Italy that morning, nothing would ever feel quite safe or ordinary again. Echoes of the battlefield. Standing on the slippery Chicago sidewalk, Hal Mason started to feel the dull thrum of anxiety that he thought he'd left behind years ago. Once upon a time, in the deserts of Iraq, he was Army Staff Sergeant Mason, medic, lifeline, and reluctant witness to scenes that never really faded with time. Even now, decades later, the sense of rain-soaked trash and distant diesel exhaust could, with the strangest trigger, sharpen into the coppery tang of blood, or the scorched tang of a hospital tent. In Little Italy, Hal often prided himself on his calm, reliable routines. Friends would joke that nothing could shake the big guy with the steady hands and even steadier nerves. But it wasn't true. Hal just bottled it up, the memories stacked and catalogued like the city's recyclables. He'd long since developed a habit. Whenever the world got weird, he'd stop, listen, and take in every detail, just like medics did when chaos broke loose. That morning, as the chunk of strange meat hit the curb and split open, Hal's world tilted. His training reacted faster than his mind. The color wasn't right. Too pale, not marbled like pork or beef, not streaked red like lamb. The density was wrong, too, and there was a faint sweetness under the metallic tang. His breathing slowed into that old, rigid rhythm, the same automatic focus he used while patching gunshot wounds. For a second, he was back in Mosul, hunkered down behind a burning Humvee, trying not to look at a soldier's ruined leg while the desert sun pressed down. Now, it wasn't the heat or the gunfire that prickled his skin. It was the silence, and the way the city's joyful noises faded outside the fog in his head. His fingers trembled as he nudged at the spilled meat again. Muscle memory told him exactly what he didn't want to know. Hal's mind raced through gruesome flashbacks, triage tents, frantic shouts, bodies in pieces, the hurried cataloging of death and injury. He'd thought leaving the war behind meant leaving that sense behind too, but here it was, an echo, loud as ever, in the ordinary American dawn. He wondered if his fellow workers felt the same chill, but when his Uauweznya glanced their way, they only looked annoyed by the mess, not alarmed. He knelt, head heavy, and choked on nerves that were both old friend and enemy. One lesson from combat was clear. Trust your gut, even when everyone else acts like the world is normal. Hal did what he'd learned to do when something was too awful to process. He froze the moment in his mind. What he didn't know then, this horror was only the beginning, and being the guy who noticed might be the very worst fate of all. High-tension investigation from the first clues. The crime scene in Little Italy bristled with a different kind of electricity, one that cut through every slice of morning sunlight on the slick pavement. Detectives and forensic techs, the best Chicago PD had, were already ducking in and out of the cordoned-off market lines. There was none of the swagger you'd see in police shows, just a tempo of clipped words, camera shutters, and gloved hands bagging every bit of evidence. When the first team opened up those trash bags, the stench struck them almost physically. One seasoned detective, years on the force, quietly muttered, "No way," as plastic and foil were peeled away to reveal even more cooked, sauce-smothered pieces of human flesh. Bizarrely domestic, like the aftermath of a cookout gone nightmarishly wrong. The horror wasn't just the presence of a body, but its careful state. Butchered, diced, and cooked as if the killer meant to hide the truth beneath everyday routine. The forensics team wasted no time, cataloging every bag and every scrap within, taking notes and photographs before itemizing each piece for lab analysis. A leading forensic pathologist arrived, wrinkling her nose at the bizarrely sweet tomato aroma that clung to every scrap of evidence. Even to untrained eyes, it was obvious. This wasn't pork, nor beef. Within hours, preliminary tests confirmed the impossible: human muscle tissue. Everything had been cooked at high heat and slathered in tomato-based sauces or soy. For many of the first responders, this would linger in nightmares for years. On tables set up beneath awnings, the investigators began gently piecing together the remains. The cuts, they realized, were erratic, almost desperate, a mix of brute force and panicked improvisation. Yet the steps needed to cook, seal, and handle all these parts took a cold, disturbing patience. Matching tattoos, scars, or even faint birthmarks was nearly impossible. The searing had erased most physical identifiers. Only the dental structure and some thin jewelry remnants offered initial hope. Detectives moved quickly to canvass local restaurants and residents. Was someone missing from the neighborhood workforce, or from any known guest lists? Had a staffer failed to show up for their shift? The usual chatter of market gossip swelled into a low buzz of suspicion and dread. Some vendors became defensive, bristling at what they perceived as intrusion, while others, frightened, spilled what little they knew. One waitress had disappeared weeks ago. A dishwasher hadn't shown up for days, but nothing pointing squarely at the victim. By mid-morning, the Chicago media was already angling for any scoop they could pry from unwilling officers. Squad cars cordoned the street, cameras flashed, and rumors spiraled. Forensics worked with dogged focus, swabbing for DNA in the hopes of reconstructing a profile. Although the body parts had been cooked, bits of skin, cartilage, even segments of fingernail were carefully preserved for lab analysis. A partial print was lifted from inside one of the trash bags, a tiny shred of hope. Yet beneath every action in the alley, the sense of unease only grew. Had the killer tried to disguise the body in the one place it might go unnoticed, hidden in plain sight among the city's food waste? Or was this some deliberate taunt, a macabre dare aimed straight at the city's heart? Each fresh clue only deepened the sense of horror, and with every trash bag hauled out of some forgotten alley, the detectives wondered if this was only the first victim, or if Chicago's Little Italy was hiding even darker secrets, tracing the clues from the landfill. Following the initial forensic shock, the Chicago PD evidence team plunged into the job like men and women possessed. Each garbage bag, some torn, some meticulously double-tied, became a grotesque clue. Unlike the neat rows of market produce nearby, the alleys behind the Little Italy stalls were a maze of dark puddles and refuse bins, now suddenly transformed into a sprawling, open-air crime scene. Detective Lori Garcia led the evidence crew, latex gloves smeared in tomato sauce, and something darker, as she cataloged the growing pile of remains. The blocks between Taylor and Loomis Street became the radius of her operation. At sunrise, she found herself knee-deep in grimy waste, barking orders to rookies straining under the physical and psychological load. Every bag was dragged out, carefully opened, and its contents logged with photography, measurements, and specimen jars. Flies and wasps buzzed in thickening heat, attracted not just by the summer's leftovers, but by the remains now revealed in horrifying stages. Bit by bit, through 12 square blocks of dumpsters and back alley drains, the team discovered more body parts. An arm wrapped in a floral-patterned bath towel, a shin cooked so thoroughly the bone threatened to poke through the skin, several plastic containers brimming with murky water and small, unidentifiable solids. Every piece was scalded, boiled, or baked. The stench, clashing smells of stewed tomato, charred flesh, cleaning products, and old grease, lent the morning an almost surreal atmosphere. Even crime scene veterans gagged at times, ducking behind garbage trucks to collect themselves. What was both remarkable and chilling was the organizational weirdness. The positioning of bags seemed almost methodical, like the killer hoped it would blend in or follow some personal logic. All the remains, upon reconstruction in the lab, pointed toward a single young woman, her age, bone structure, and skin tone hinting at someone in her early 20s. Yet her head was conspicuously missing. All torso and limb parts bore signs of both amateurish post-mortem mutilation, deep, reckless cuts, and odd domesticity. Some were chopped with kitchen knives, others hacked roughly as if the murderer oscillated between panic and obsessive control. The team soon stumbled across telltale oddities: a piece of red thread matching nothing in the local restaurants, shards of a broken bracelet, the remnants of a bath towel from a department chain more likely to appear in a downtown apartment than a restaurant supply van. The positioning of the parts, all freshly disposed within a 24-hour time frame, led Garcia to believe that the killer had made more than one trip, the trip probably acting in the deep hours before dawn. Despite the grotesque horror, no part looked as if it had been eaten or prepared as food for sale. The police speculated that ketchup and sauces had been used to mask odors and misdirect any quick scan from the sanitation crews. But then, a janitor noticed greasy fingerprints inside one of the bags and called it out. Garcia immediately ordered dusting for prints, and techs scrambled to swab every bag, collecting evidence. Some of it smeared, but one partial fingerprint still legible and promising. Each new discovery, though, deepened the mystery and thickened the tension weaving through the market that day. The mystery of the victim's identity. Detective Lori Garcia had always believed that every victim was the center of their own universe, a mosaic of memories, dreams, and heartbreak. But staring at the processed evidence laid out against the sterile light of the city morgue, she was faced with a different kind of void. A murder victim, with no name, no family, and no one in the city who seemed to notice she was gone. For hours, the forensic pathologists and techs had worked over the reconstructed remains found in trash bags and bins throughout the alleys of Little Italy. The body, though savagely dismembered and cooked to conceal evidence, clearly belonged to a young woman. The bones slender but resilient, joints unscarred by heavy labor, skin pale under the traces of burned sauce and cleaning chemicals. A DNA analysis pegged her age at just over 20, and further medical examination found no signs of past childbirth, no surgical scars, and little in the way of chronic illness. Her hands, when reassembled, were slender, the nails neatly clipped, suggesting someone who took care in her appearance but worked with her hands. There was nothing to identify her, no wallet, jewelry, or ID among the remains. Even the fragile traces of clothing had been reduced to singed scraps of synthetic fabric, useless for tracing a brand or purchase record. The only small clue was a bright red thread sewn into a floral bath towel found wrapped around one forearm. A mass-produced towel sold in dozens of discount department stores throughout the city and surrounding suburbs. For all Chicago PD's high-tech resources, this particular victim seemed to have melted into the cacophony of city life, unseen until her most vulnerable moment. Detectives, led by Garcia, began a painstaking search for missing persons that could match, scouring local, state, and then national databases. With no head and facial features obliterated by fire and boiling, the traditional go-to, facial recognition, was out. Medical examiner reports circulated among precincts. Had anyone reported an employee gone missing, a girlfriend or daughter last seen near the market? But restaurant managers, landlords, bartenders, and night shift security guards all shook their heads. Young people in Little Italy came and went with the seasons, sometimes skipping town when work dried up. Some left for college, others drifted to the West Coast. Several women were reported missing, but after cross-checking medical records and DNA, none matched the victim. Weeks turned into months. Every lead, every fragmentary tip from street informants and overworked social workers led to a dead end. Garcia's team badgered homeless shelters, women's advocacy groups, and university housing units, passing around composite sketches based on the victim's approximate bone structure and height. Sometimes, a glimmer of hope arrived. A tip about a waitress who stopped showing up. A roommate worried after a friend moved out without warning, but each avenue fizzled. All the while, the unease tightened, a sense that the girl's anonymity was itself a kind of second crime. Even the press, with nothing tangible to sensationalize beyond the gruesomeness of the crime, began to speculate wildly about the victim's identity. Anonymous. She could have been anyone, one tabloid headline blared, fanning rumors. An illegal immigrant, a runaway, even a lost heiress who'd wound up in the city's underbelly. Garcia hated the way the public's imagination twisted the real woman into a symbol, her true self erased by the very horror of her end. DNA became the last hope. Sample after sample was sent to federal labs, cross-checked against criminal offenders, missing persons, victims of trafficking, hospital records. Still, a brick wall. Technicians tried running the gene markers through familial search, hoping for a distant cousin or even a third-degree match. But it seemed this woman existed just outside the weave of America's databases, a thread dropped from the fabric of the city. Even searches expanded into neighboring states, and when that led nowhere, the team considered the possibility she might have been a tourist, a visitor for work, school, or a fleeting love affair. Airport and bus terminal surveillance from the previous month was reviewed, searching for anyone who fit the victim's size and build, pulling ticket manifests and combing through arrivals. Frustration mounted. Meanwhile, the public's shock gave way to anger and, eventually, apathy. Garcia felt a chill as coverage moved on to fresher chaos. She found herself haunted by who the woman might have been, a local or a stranger, a woman escaping something or searching for something better. Her superiors grew restive. Closing the case meant putting a name to the remains. Until then, the psychological weight was inescapable. One by one, Garcia's team returned to the most basic questions. Did anyone recall a woman, early 20s, average height, probably slim, who had dropped out of sight that September? Records from local clinics were searched for patients who'd stopped showing up for appointments. Social media feeds were combed for gaps. Friends who hadn't posted, text threads gone dark. The detectives even visited tattoo parlors, downtown salons, gyms, anywhere young women congregated, describing the victim's build and skin tone. Nothing clicked. Family, work, friends. Everything about the victim was blurred, washed away by either the killer's meticulous planning or by the sheer anonymity bred in a transient, crowded city. But Garcia didn't give up. For her, the case had become personal, a silent promise to the lost, unidentified woman. She urged the team on. The city, for all its size, had a heartbeat, and someone, somewhere, had to care about the vanished young woman. The grinding police work continued, but the mystery seemed to grow deeper. How could a person so young, so clearly alive not long ago, simply slip through every web meant to keep people safe? By Christmas, the case files took up an entire wall. Taped on a window by Garcia's desk, above the alley-lit city, were 4 words in Sharpie. Who was she, really? Night after night, the city teemed beyond the frosted glass, and Garcia swore she wouldn't rest until there was an answer. A small clue, a major breakthrough. Detective Lori Garcia was breathing in the stale air of the precinct when the first call came from the city lab. In the days since the gruesome discovery in Little Italy, the police had been crossing and recrossing dead ends. No useful video, no witnesses, no clear pattern, and a victim who seemed invisible by every bureaucratic measure. It was as if the killer had planned, with methodical brilliance, to erase every thread of her connection to the world. The team's bulletin board was a dense web of string and notes, but the center, the why and who, remained empty. Garcia felt each hour creep by like wet concrete as she hunted for anything. A slip, a stray print, even a name that didn't quite fit with the hush of public record. The breakthrough, when it arrived, was almost absurd in its mundanity. A partial fingerprint. The night before, one of the junior evidence techs in forensics, Matthew, had insisted on re-examining every trash bag, not just where they'd found remains, but every single bag hauled from the alleys within the deployment radius. He was working overtime, hunched over the lab table, fingers numb from stubborn adhesive residue and the endless application of black dust. That's when he noticed something odd. A greasy handprint, half smeared, preserved by a trick of the bag's bending plastic. It glistened under the halogen lamp, fragmented yet unmistakably human. Matthew called Garcia at 5 a.m., his voice trembling from a cocktail of caffeine, nerves, and the possibility of actual progress. Every investigator knows the rush that comes from the first real clue. However small, it's enough to keep hope on life support. Garcia arrived on site 30 minutes later. She gazed down at the film-like pattern on the lab's screen, a swirl of ridge lines interrupted by the deep scoring of food debris. The print wasn't full, but there was enough to catch the distinctive arch and a bifurcated line that stood out like a signature. She placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder, quietly proud of his meticulous persistence. The print was immediately run through every database the city could access: local, state, federal, even military records. As suspected, there was no direct match. No prior offender, no prior arrest, no sign the killer had ever been in official trouble before. The computer spat out a short report. Index not found. But Garcia wouldn't be stopped by an empty result. She called in favors and widened the search radius. Could the print belong to a restaurant worker, a cleaning crew member, maybe a truck driver delivering goods in the dead of night? Meanwhile, she pressed the forensic team to swab for DNA under the greasy residue of the print. If the killer had sweated or pressed too hard through the gloves, a skin fragment might remain. The techs nodded, already on it, their methodical patience a counter to the feverish hope in Garcia's gut. While the evidence was processed, Garcia returned to Little Italy. She retraced the killer's likely route through the back alleys, squinting at dumpsters with new intensity. The street had returned to its ordinary hum, but the knowledge of what had happened behind those brick walls hovered like a curse. Garcia imagined the murderer, methodical, careful, yet tired enough to slip, leaving a single print in the early hours. Hours of work, fear, calculation, and just one moment of distraction. That's the thing about criminal confidence. Sooner or later, it falters. She interviewed the sanitation team again, this time zeroing in on procedure and process. Did they recall any strange interruption? Any bag heavier than normal? Any vehicle parked too long? Hal Mason, graying and taciturn after the shock, remembered a strange van, a generic white box truck idling on the corner, marked only by peeling magnetic decals. The detail had seemed unremarkable, but after hours upon hours of reflection, it dug at him. Someone was watching us cycle the trash, like they wanted to be sure it got picked up quick, Hal finally admitted. Garcia canvassed area businesses, collecting fragments of surveillance camera footage. Most only captured wide, grainy shots of the sidewalk. Others filmed nothing after midnight. But she noticed a pattern. Along one route, security footage between two alley cameras showed a gap, a blank that lasted about 8 minutes in the dead of night. On either end of the gap, streets were empty except for a figure in dark, nondescript clothing. Backpack, ball cap, head down. Garcia noted the time. She wrote down the addresses, cross-mapped the intervals with the garbage routes, and calculated that the killer must have known the market's rhythms well. Over the next 24 hours, Garcia's team worked with digital forensics to enhance and analyze each blurry shadow that entered or left the alleys. Nothing gave away the suspect's face. Whoever it was moved with calculated care, avoiding any direct glance at lenses. Yet, at one crucial moment, the individual lingered beneath a flickering light. In one frame, a gloved hand, left, swung the bag, but the angle of the wrist matched the partial fingerprint found on the trash bag. It was a tiny correlation, but it stitched the physical evidence to the timeline. Garcia felt a jolt of vindication. The smallest mistake could undo the most fastidious criminal. That afternoon, they reviewed employee records from every establishment in the area. The killer was likely someone who wouldn't stand out, perhaps a worker, a delivery driver, or someone with ties to the service industry. Garcia and her team ran background checks, looking for new hires or recently resigned employees, especially anyone who matched the general build and handedness revealed in the footage. Dozens of names filtered into her spreadsheet, but nothing concrete surfaced in the first round. Instead of growing frustrated, Garcia doubled down on seemingly trivial details. She interviewed local restaurant managers about towel inventory, following the red-threaded floral bath towel found in the evidence. Most shrugged it off as common, but one cafe owner remembered ordering a bulk supply for employee showers and kitchen cleanups. Her records pointed to a supplier, then to a series of transactions logged with a hotel just outside the radius of the current search. Garcia's curiosity spiked. She called for the surveillance recordings from the hotel's delivery dock, focusing on the loading bays active in the early morning hours, right before the body parts began appearing in the market bins. The tapes showed an unmarked van, white, boxy, the same make described by Hal. The driver, masked, unloaded several lumpy plastic bags and placed them in the public dumpster, ignoring hotel staff. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the window when the crucial fingerprint was deposited. While the imagery didn't reveal the suspect's face, it provided Garcia with a tangible connection, a bridge from bloody chaos back toward the world of motive and opportunity. Her investigation turned a corner. The clues, insignificant on their own, now circled ever closer. The combination of a partial print, a distinctive towel, and the timeline of the van's movement began to draw the shadow of a real suspect. In Garcia's line of work, this was the moment hope and dread danced together. A leap forward, but never quite enough. Garcia's mind whirred with possibilities. Was the killer a disgruntled worker, someone familiar with both the rhythms of the market and the unforgiving anonymity of city life? Or was it someone far more calculated, blending into the city's underbelly, hiding in plain sight? The public, largely oblivious, carried on. A city too big, too busy to see monsters in its midst unless forced to look. Every detail, no matter how minute, became precious. The way the bags were tied, the chemicals used to clean the remnants, the sequence of deliveries. Garcia began working late into the night, reviewing evidence by lamplight as her team passed her hard-won coffee and comfort food. They combed through bank statements, cross-checked timestamps, and started swabbing dumpsters for additional prints or fibers. Within days, another minuscule clue emerged. A tiny flake of blue paint embedded in a corner seam of one bag, matching a maintenance bucket from a supply closet in a nearby apartment complex. Garcia dispatched officers with evidence kits, watching closely as they questioned building supers and combed storage rooms. Again, the city itself seemed to conspire against her, swallowing secrets and leaving her with only fragments. Just when frustration almost won, a call came from a young maintenance man in the neighboring building. He'd seen the white van early one morning, its driver nervously unloading trash. Garcia felt excitement tingle in her veins as his testimony, corroborated by hotel security, rounded out the pattern. The killer hadn't vanished into thin air. Bit by bit, the evidence trail built toward momentum, a force strong enough to pull the case from darkness and back into the unforgiving glare of day. The partial fingerprint, the towel, the van, and a sliver of blue paint, each a small, almost forgettable detail, together formed the skeleton key Garcia needed. It wasn't an open and shut case. The next weeks would demand endless cross-referencing, cautious interviews, and delicate negotiations with the hotel and apartment management, all under the throbbing suspicion of community panic once the story broke. Yet to Garcia, it felt remarkable. One person's relentless dedication and careful observation saved a case on the brink of going cold. It's often true in detective work that the grand breakthroughs are really mosaics made of 1,000 undramatic moments. The small clue, a smudge, a towel, a twitch of movement, on a flickering screen, became the inflection point. Each thread woven together drew Garcia and the city of Chicago nearer to the heart of the darkness prowling beneath their feet. She couldn't shake the sense of something monumental unfolding, not just a solution, but a reckoning with the hidden violence of urban anonymity. And late one night, sleep elusive, Adrenaline coursing, and her own face reflected in the office window, Garcia realized the truth. Justice, especially for the forgotten, is always a matter of details, determination, and that one impossible break. Parents searching in desperate hope. Mrs. and Mr. Tran had spent months existing in a limbo that swayed uneasily between dread and denial. Their suburban Aurora home was filled with reminders of their daughter Jessica, her photos on the mantel, childhood trophies, postcards taped up on the refrigerator door, each a relic of a girl who had grown into a young woman full of stubborn courage. For more than a year, she had all but disappeared from their lives. No calls, no texts, not even a whispered update through friends of friends. It was as though she had vanished into the city's endless currents, swept away beyond the reach of a parent's worry. The missing person reports filed at first had gotten shunted aside in the flood of urban police work. She was an adult, probably off on an adventure, looking for work, or just needing space. Her parents knew better, but they were made to feel overprotective, old-fashioned, and out of step with modern independence. Still, they never surrendered hope. Every missed birthday, every silent milestone, and every empty seat at the dinner table etched the loss deeper into their daily ritual. Mrs. Tran, whose English bore the gentle sing-song of her Vietnamese homeland, would sit at the edge of her bed most nights, clutching a phone that never rang. Her husband, formerly a math teacher, took to scribbling lists, people to call, addresses to visit, numbers carefully copied from faded business cards Jessica had left behind. He spent countless hours at his computer, creating spreadsheets of her contacts, possible workplaces, bank transactions, distant cousins or classmates who might have heard something. Missing person flyers, in Vietnamese and English, adorned the community center and neighborhood cafes. At church, they slipped a photo into every prayer request basket. When word finally reached them, a call from the city police, half a world away from the neat tranquility of their living room, the Tran family's collective breath faltered. Mrs. Tran felt the change immediately, the tone in the detective's voice, the careful phrasing and stilted pauses. She braced herself, a mother's intuition already knowing that any hope they still nursed was about to collapse under the weight of terrible certainty. Jessica. That was the name the technician spoke first. DNA testing from the Little Italy investigation had finally matched her. Records, keepings from a minor surgery years ago, samples from her old dentist, a spare hairbrush mailed in desperation to the authorities. They wanted to confirm her identity once more, in person. She was gone. They needed to come to the city and talk. Mrs. Tran wept quietly as her husband made arrangements, holding hands across the kitchen table, both of them thinking about their last conversation with Jessica. They'd argued about her new job, waitressing in Chicago, none too safe, always late hours, sometimes in the company of people her parents distrusted. She'd called them overbearing, out of touch. That was the last time they'd heard her voice. In the city, the Tran family was met by Detective Garcia, whose face bore the exhaustion of months tangled in the grim aftermath of Jessica's murder. The detective spoke gently, making no promises, expressing cautious regret. There was an interview, questions as careful as they were dreadful, distinctive birthmarks, scars, childhood illnesses, favorite music, places she loved to eat. The parents answered, sometimes overspeaking, sometimes going silent when tears overtook them. The city's hurt, the casual, relentless violence lurking beneath its surface, felt like a betrayal. Aurora was supposed to be safe. Their daughter was supposed to make them proud, not become a cold statistic in a city's ever-growing file of the missing and the dead. What tormented Mr. Tran most was the sense of helplessness. He had tried, oh, how he'd tried, to find Jessica himself, trekking through neighborhoods, knocking on the doors of her friends' apartments, even confronting her former landlord, who dismissed his questions with bored shrugs. Mr. Tran called every number saved in Jessica's battered old voicemail, always meeting dead air or disconnected lines. He clung fiercely to the few encouraging rumors. Jessica seen working in a bakery, Jessica moving in with a new boyfriend, Jessica calling an old co-worker for help, none of which panned out under scrutiny. Each hope, false or true, only prolonged the agony, like reopening a wound to see if it still bled. Mrs. Tran carried the guilt in quieter ways. She rifled through her daughter's possessions, reading and rereading postcards, diary fragments, scraps of paper tucked into jacket pockets. A worn brown teddy bear, Jessica's childhood comfort, rested on her pillow every night. She scoured social media with the help of a neighbor's child, hoping for a stray comment or a tagged photo, anything to confirm their daughter had simply chosen a freer, riskier path. But one by one, the possibilities faded until only heartbreak remained. When the official word came, the pain was almost a relief. Here at last was certainty. But that relief was jagged and raw, overshadowed by the details of the case. Detective Garcia had to break the news with all the delicacy she could muster. Jessica's remains had been discovered in a way that defied both decency and imagination. The methods, the cooking, the disposal, the attempts to erase her identity, were so horrific that for a moment, Mrs. Tran could only stare numbly at the folder of evidence, too shocked for tears. The parents found themselves thrust into a new world of bureaucracy and public attention. Suddenly, they were not just the grieving family, but unwilling participants in press conferences, police briefings, and endless interviews. Photographs of Jessica, always smiling in happier times, were splashed across local TV. Reporters called at all hours, seeking a comment, a memory, a quote that might make the story more sensational. The Trans refused, as much out of grief as fear. A private, quiet family, they recoiled from the glare. Jessica had always hated drama, Mrs. Tran remembered. Let her rest, she pleaded in her heart. There was a bitter irony to the recognition Jessica finally received, her life unnoticed by the city, acknowledged at last only by her absence and the horror that had claimed her. Mrs. Tran wondered aloud, to the detective and to herself, why no one in the bustling neighborhoods where Jessica lived and worked had asked after her. Was anonymity the price of freedom? Had her daughter trusted the wrong people, or simply slipped through the gaps in a city defined by its constant movement? Compounding their grief was the slow revelation of Jessica's struggles over the last year. Sorting through emails and messages recovered from her phone, the detectives pieced together fragments of her final months: a new boyfriend with a dark temper, an apartment search that never went anywhere, money sent home less frequently, mounting debt. Her work as a waitress in Little Italy had left her exhausted, and even her friends had begun to drift away. There were hints of arguments, threats, panicked reunions that fizzled into silence. The parents read the digital archaeology of her life with growing horror. How could a daughter so loved become so lost? The official meetings passed in a blur. Forms were signed, evidence returned, questions asked and answered with a resigned, painful repetition. Mr. Tran began to dream of Jessica, seeing her at the bus stop or glancing in accidentally at a crowded street fair in Chicago, his mind refusing to accept the finality of loss. Some nights, Mrs. Tran would awaken thinking she'd heard Jessica's keys in the lock or her voice at the door, only to remember the cold facts. Their daily routines became rituals of remembrance, lighting incense, cooking Jessica's favorite meals, offering silent prayers to ancestors. They called her old friends, not to demand information anymore, but to share stories and rekindle happier memories. Among the most difficult tasks lay in reclaiming Jessica's name from the violence of her end. The press spun wild tales: runaway waitress, tragic immigrant, victim of the city's darkness. The police file labeled her as a body, a specimen, a case to be closed. But for her parents, Jessica was still their brave, loving, complicated daughter. The girl who snuck out after curfew for midnight foe, who won a spelling bee by spelling perseverance, who argued passionately about fairness and independence. Family, teachers, and neighbors gathered to remember what she had been, not just how she'd died. A quiet memorial at their church drew dozens of mourners, most of them remembering Jessica as a bright presence, a quick wit, and a source of kindness in a sometimes uncaring city. Through it all, the question of why Jessica, why now, gnawed at Mr. Tran, refusing to be answered by the progress of the police case. Sometimes he raged at the world, at a justice system that failed to protect, at friends who didn't notice she was gone, at himself for every angry word exchanged before she disappeared. Mrs. Tran, more gentle but equally tormented, blamed the distance between generations, cultures, and dreams. Ultimately, the Tran family's pain was doubled by the absence of closure. The slow, bureaucratic process of the justice system, the media's shifting focus, the city's tumult, none granted them the clarity they yearned for. They clung instead to love and to small acts of remembrance, their own resistance against letting Jessica's life end as only a footnote in a headline. A colleague reveals a secret. In every high-profile homicide, there comes a phase when facts run dry, and all that remains are the messy threads of human relationships and the contradictions of memory. So it was with Jessica's case. The forensic puzzle had delivered little more than horror, a woman brutally disposed of, her identity erased by both cruelty and fire. The police, oscillating between exhaustion and gritty hope, realized they needed to revisit the most basic avenue of all, the people who had actually known Jessica in life. Detective Lori Garcia knew the drill. With evidence stalling and media pressure intensifying, she painstakingly combed through personnel records, chat logs, and social media feeds from every job Jessica had held in Little Italy. Eventually, a name emerged, again and again. Amy Nguyen, colleague, friend, confidant, and one of the few people in the city who'd truly tried to keep in touch when Jessica began to disappear from daily life. Amy was quiet, but observant, with the sort of emotional intelligence that made her a natural at both waitressing and reading between the lines. When Garcia finally reached her, Amy was first defensive, too used to dismissing drunk patrons and skeptical landlords to trust a badge thrust in her face. But relenting, she agreed to meet in the back room of the cafe, where they'd both spent countless sleepless shifts, plates of linguine clattering as they traded gossip and dreams. The room itself was unchanged, coffee-stained counters, the constant rattle of the dishwasher, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Amy fidgeted with a napkin as she spoke, nervous yet visibly relieved to finally talk about the coils of worry that had haunted her since Jessica's sudden disappearance. She was scared, Amy said, voice low, trying to keep her composure as the detective listened. Jessica tried to act tough, but there were nights she'd show up with her hands shaking, eyes all puffy, and pretend nothing was wrong. I knew something was up, but I thought it was just more work drama, or some new boyfriend. I never thought this would be how it ended. Garcia encouraged Amy to elaborate, gently prodding at the perimeter of grief and guilt. Amy described an increasingly troubled friendship. Jessica, normally bursting with optimism, had turned secretive in the months before her disappearance. She changed phone numbers several times, stopped posting on her usual group chats, and grew erratic with her schedule. Amy recalled a chilling conversation after close one night when Jessica confessed she was being stalked and that she had gotten involved with someone who had the power and the money to make problems vanish. Jessica never named him outright. She only called him the big guy and hinted he had connections not just in business, but with the criminal underbelly of the city. Amy had tried to convince her to go to the police, but Jessica scoffed. You don't go to the law when you're up against people like that. You just keep your head down and hope they forget. Amy remembered something else. Jessica had quietly started saving cash in a battered envelope taped under her dresser. They dreamed of quitting together, moving to another town, starting over. Yet every time Jessica got close, something happened. A threat, a gift, a sudden warm reconciliation with her mystery man, and she would let the idea go. Amy watched her friend get pulled deeper and deeper, always promising that next month things would change. The conversation took a sharp turn when Garcia gently asked about men in Jessica's orbit, especially any recent relationships involving gifts, jealousy, or unusual control. Amy hesitated, eyes darting to the window. Eventually, she whispered the name that had rattled her for months: John Carter. John was no stranger to anyone who worked the Little Italy scene. A slick, silver-haired middle manager at a regional construction firm, John was the kind of regular who tipped big and flirted easily. He carried himself with an air of harmless mischief, always ready with a fat roll of bills for lavish dinners. But Amy described a darker side. John was tightly wound, prone to sudden mood swings, and quietly relentless when someone crossed him. Rumors swirled that he liked to control his lovers, and when things soured, he didn't let go easily. Jessica had confided that their relationship had turned transactional. John would loan her large sums, and over time, the line between gift and obligation blurred. Jessica tried to break things off several times, but every time she did, the messages got more explicit and threatening. John called at all hours, showed up outside her work, and sometimes even waited across the street after Amy and Jessica closed up. One particularly haunting memory stood out. Jessica told me, a week before she vanished, that she finally had enough money to pay him back and walk away for good. She was scared, but kind of hopeful. She said she'd meet him one last time, give back the cash, and then be done. I told her to bring someone, or at least tell me where she was going. She just smiled and told me not to worry. If only I had insisted more. Amy's voice broke with regret. The information detonated through the case file like dynamite. Suddenly, Jessica's downward spiral, the threats and the strange mixture of gifts and ultimatums, made a chilling kind of sense. Garcia quietly thanked Amy, promising discretion, but also honesty. This lead would change the case. Within 48 hours, the investigative net closed around John Carter. Cell phone records, GPS logs, and financial statements were seized and analyzed. Carter himself maintained the icy composure of someone who believes in their own invincibility. When confronted, he initially laughed off his relationship with Jessica as nothing more than a fling. But a forensic audit revealed a damning pattern. Repeated late-night transfers, cash withdrawals, and a network of disposable phones registered to names that connected, in a twist of poetic justice, back to the time cards at Jessica and Amy's restaurant. Meanwhile, Garcia returned to Amy for one final question. Had Jessica ever mentioned being threatened with violence or having any kind of blackmail material held against her? Amy's hands shook as she recalled a burned CD Jessica had once shown her. Evidence, Jessica said, just in case things go bad. The CD was never found in the victim's belongings, but Amy pointed the police toward Jessica's old roommate, who remembered Jessica hiding things in creative ways around the apartment. Detectives scoured the old apartment, now empty for months. In a false ceiling tile, they found a small, dirty envelope, a battered CD, a second prepaid SIM card, and a list of numbers, written in Jessica's looping, hurried script. The CD's contents shocked everyone in the squad room. A teary, hesitant Jessica filming herself, outlining her fears, reciting the threats and amounts, and naming John Carter as the man who would do anything to keep me quiet. The case had turned. With the secret witness of a friend, a hidden envelope, and the digital ghost of Jessica's last plea for help, Garcia finally had what the case needed: a motive, a suspect, and a final message from a victim whose struggle had almost been lost under layers of violence and neglect. Amy's tears and her stubborn honesty had cracked the silence that buried Jessica's fate. The truth, spatters and all, finally blazed through the shadows, questioning the suspect and the web of justification. Detective Lori Garcia had sat through countless interrogations in her career, but there was always a different kind of electricity in the air when the man across from her was not just a prime suspect, but almost certainly a killer, one whose actions spoke of both intelligence and chilling cruelty. The room was cold, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that cast sterile shadows. The city's hum was reduced to a dull buzz just beyond the windowless walls. For Garcia, this was a crucible. The moment truth was hammered out between the facts she already knew and the stories a suspect would spin in the hope of escape. John Carter was escorted in, hands cuffed, but shoulders squared with a composure that bordered on arrogance. In his impeccable suit, hair still perfectly slicked back, he looked almost respectable, more like a weary executive than a man implicated in a crime that had horrified a city. But his eyes betrayed him. Garcia met his gaze, unflinching, and allowed herself a silent note of satisfaction as she observed his controlled breathing, his hands flexing in minute, nervous twitches. He was ready for a battle, already preparing his lines and calculations. The questioning began with formalities: Carter's name, date of birth, employment history, all routine. Garcia led the conversation calmly, laying out easy questions at first, forcing Carter to settle into the rhythm of replies. His attorney, a suited man who took meticulous notes, sat close by, eyes darting between the detective and his client. It was only when Garcia turned to the timeline of events, detailing Carter's whereabouts on the night of Jessica Tran's disappearance, the late-night financial transactions, the use of a white van, and his digital footprint, that the cracks began to show. Carter kept his answers clipped and evasive. He claimed an alibi, late-night work, invoices to review, a business dinner that stretched into the small hours. Yet Garcia pushed, shining a spotlight on every discrepancy. Surveillance footage that caught a van matching his company's make and model, receipts for bleach and gallons of cleaning chemicals. But most damning, the partial fingerprint lifted from one of the trash bags, matched with near certainty to Carter's left hand. For the first time, Carter's facade shifted. His jaw tightened just so, and his lawyer leaned in, whispering that Carter should remain silent. But the detective practiced, changed tactics. She brought out the evidence, printed photographs of the bags, documentation of the recovered towel with the distinct red thread, and fragments of jewelry that once belonged to Jessica. Garcia spoke softly, yet with unyielding intensity. You and Ms. Tran. She was in deep fear for her life. Co-workers, friends, every record we have shows she tried again and again to break away. Why? Carter hesitated. At first he stonewalled, shaking his head. But the hussy, mounting evidence, and perhaps a sense of exhaustion, eroded his resolve. With a sudden burst of anger disguised as resignation, he spat out. She wouldn't stop. She kept coming back, threatening to embarrass me. Everything I built, everything I worked for, she was ready to trash it over a few bad choices. I tried to cut her loose. She wanted more. The lawyer cleared his throat, alarmed, but Carter continued. It just spiraled. I tried to help her. Then she started blackmailing. Garcia pressed deeper, keenly aware of the psychological dance unfolding. Mr. Carter, Jessica was found in pieces, cooked, bagged, thrown into the city's trash. That doesn't happen out of desperation alone. You made 100 choices, with every cut, with every trip, with every bag. Why? Carter's justification spun like a web, a story about a dangerous game that got out of control, a toxic relationship, constant demands, fear of public disgrace, of losing his career, family, and reputation. He painted Jessica as manipulative, unstable, someone who pushed him to the brink with threats and emotional outbursts. Garcia listened, her expression unreadable, while Carter wove his narrative. I tried to end it amicably, but she wouldn't let go. I just snapped. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But once you cross that line, you just keep going. All my life, I was in control. That night, I lost it. It was classic self-justification, the defense of a man attempting to recast himself as victim than perpetrator. The psychologist in the observation room scribbled notes, recognizing both narcissism and denial behind every carefully chosen word. Yet, with every explanation, Carter revealed more than he concealed. When Garcia finally spoke, she wasn't accusatory, but heartbreakingly direct. John, no matter what Jessica said or did, no matter how complicated your affair became, you always had a choice. You chose silence. You chose violence. You chose to try to erase her from this world. Carter lowered his head, tears welling. Whether from fear, regret, or pure self-pity was impossible to know. I didn't want to become this. I really didn't. But people like her, they never stop. The session stretched for hours, circling through Carter's justifications. Fear, anger, desperation, embarrassment, betrayal. Garcia challenged them all, fact by fact, detail by grisly detail. She read aloud passages from Jessica's diary, messages to friends that painted her as scared but determined, not manipulative. She confronted Carter with the images of a devastated family, the legacy of pain his actions created. As the sun set over the city, the room grew dim. Carter's confessions became quieter, weighed down by exhaustion. His lawyer asked for recess after recess, frantically hoping to stop the slow hemorrhage of self-incrimination. Finally, Garcia slid across the table a folder, photos from the landfill, the brutal truth laid bare. This, she said softly, was a woman who wanted to live, who asked for help, and deserved none of this. No amount of justification can change that. In the silence, even Carter seemed to shrink beneath the enormity of what he'd done. And as detectives led him away to his cell, Garcia exhaled, the bittersweet relief of a confession tangled with the knowledge that no reason would ever fill the void left behind. For the city, and for Jessica's family, this was the beginning of justice, marred by a truth more horrifying than any fiction. John Carter had spoken, but his reasons, however detailed or desperate, were never enough. A horrifying path of crime, dismemberment, cooking, and a psychological game. John Carter's account, after his arrest, painted a portrait of horror that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. Stripped of his polished exterior, John began to recount the chilling, methodical process that followed his last violent confrontation with Jessica Tran. What unfolded went far beyond a crime of passion. It became a calculated descent into the grotesque, a mixture of cold logic, sickening improvisation, and mental unraveling shrouded by the rituals of everyday city life. It started, John said, not with a grand plan, but with panic. After their explosive argument escalated to violence and Jessica's sudden, tragic death, he was stunned into numb inertia. The room was silent, except for his own ragged breathing. Only minutes before, he had paced as a man haunted by jealousy, debt, and resentment. Now, facing the finality of a body on the floor, his overworked mind spun into survival mode. He locked the door, drew the blinds, and sat motionless, listening to the city's oblivious hum, while inside, his world shattered. What made the horror linger was not just the act, but everything that came after. At first, John considered calling the police. He told detectives, perhaps even believed for a moment, that he wanted to confess. But the fear of losing his job, reputation, and freedom proved stronger. Trapped by the twin engines of pride and terror, he snapped into action with a methodical cruelty that belied the chaos of his emotions. The entire apartment became a stage for an unspeakable performance. On the surface, the neatness of a bachelor's routine; beneath, the painstaking cover-up to hide a crime that would rock Chicago's Little Italy. In the initial hours, John worked feverishly. He wrapped Jessica's body in towels and plastic, items pulled from kitchen drawers and bathroom shelves, the kind of materials any city dweller would have at hand. The sense of unreality only deepened as he used what he'd learned in science classes years before: how cold slows decay, how heat erases traces, how marinating flesh with acidic tomato sauce can mask the smell of rot. These were not the acts of a true criminal mastermind, but of a desperate, increasingly unhinged man improvising beneath the weight of stress and fear. Each decision, John later claimed, was made not for pleasure, but for necessity, an assertion that rang hollow given the chilling lengths to which he went. By nightfall, John had done what most would find unimaginable. He dismembered the body with a set of kitchen knives, working in frantic, nauseating bursts, his apartment filling with the smells of cleaning chemicals and, later, something darker and sourer. The clinical detachment with which he spoke in interviews appalled detectives. He described his tools, his routines, the need to work in brief, feverish increments so as not to arouse suspicion among neighbors. He purchased bags of ice, stowed sections in a chest freezer borrowed from a friend's apartment storage unit, and began plotting the next stage: disposal. John's attempts to dispose of the body revealed not just a desperate urge to erase, but a strange logic that blurred the line between crime and daily ritual. Leaning on his knowledge of garbage routes and city pickup times, gained from idle chats with a friend who worked sanitation, he developed a schedule for transporting small sealed packages in the dead of night. Sometimes he simply rolled a suitcase through the back stairwells, each trip painstakingly planned to avoid building cameras and odd glances. Over several nights, the remnants of Jessica's life quietly vanished into dumpsters and alleyway bins, all but her head, which in a twisted gesture he kept hidden in a locked safe at a friend's apartment, a secret token of guilt and dominance. If the physical actions were monstrous, the psychological games John played with himself made the ordeal even more disturbing. He oscillated between moments of frenzied erasure, scrubbing surfaces until his hands bled, and stretches of false normalcy, resuming work emails and small talk with neighbors. When questioned, he would insist that everything he did was driven by necessity. "I didn't want her family to suffer. I didn't want anyone to find out." Yet his every action radiated a terrible need for control, not just over the crime scene, but over the narrative of what had happened. He cooked portions of the remains, an act both pragmatic and perverse. John's reasoning, he explained in chilling detail, was to mask odors so sanitation workers and stray dogs wouldn't dig through the trash and provoke early discovery. He boiled bones in large pasta pots, stewed flesh in tomato-based sauces to produce the sickly sweet scent that first alerted Hal Mason. He even baked some pieces, imagining that the intense heat would destroy DNA. The kitchen that once produced shared meals for Jessica and friends was now transformed into a macabre laboratory. Cabinet shelves lined with bleach, gloves, and bottles of industrial cleaner. Every towel, every kitchen knife, every piece of plastic wrap became saturated with the evidence of his crimes. Throughout the ordeal, John maintained the elaborate fiction of ordinary life. He answered texts from work colleagues, paid his rent on time, and even met friends for dinner. It seemed almost impossible, but the fractured pace of modern city living and the anonymity afforded by noisy neighborhoods and transient tenants allowed the nightmare to fester in plain sight. Neighbors remembered odd smells, strange hours, and sudden cleaning sprees, but none felt compelled to call the authorities. It was only when Hal, the sanitation worker, noticed the peculiar weight and warmth of certain trash bags and the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet odor that the truth began to surface. John's mind games extended beyond the act of concealment. He would speak later, during psychological evaluation and interrogation, about dissociation, how he compartmentalized his horror and convinced himself that as long as the crime was hidden, it was partly undone. In his rare lucid moments, he replayed the night of Jessica's death, searching for different choices, only to plunge himself deeper into self-pity and blame. He even tried to rationalize the most grotesque elements of the ordeal, suggesting that every grisly act was forced by circumstances beyond his control. Sleepless nights spent cleaning, the constant terror of discovery, and a mounting sense of unreality that blurred the border between guilt and victimhood. Each day, as new sections of Jessica quietly disappeared into the city's waste system, John became a master of living parallel lives. He meticulously laundered towels and clothing, wiped bloodstains with hospital-grade disinfectant, acquired through connections at his job, and erased digital footprints, deleting texts, scrubbing call logs, and wiping shared computers. He moved furniture, painted over stains, and rented carpet cleaners. This was not just a physical cover-up, but an ongoing psychological effort to rewrite the past. The apartment, once a place of comfort, became claustrophobic, a prison built by his own hands, furnished with reminders of a decision he could never reverse. At night, John's paranoia crept in. He scoured local news reports, searching for any hint of police activity near Little Italy, jumping at every siren. He cycled between self-justification, "She threatened me, I had no choice," and deep, crushing shame. He thought about turning himself in, but each time he reached for the phone, he faltered, convinced he might still get away. The delusion of control was powerful. With every successful disposal, he felt a fleeting sense of triumph, followed by a black wave of dread. Psychologists later marveled at the strange blend of logic and madness. John was neither a deranged serial killer nor an unthinking brute. In reality, his actions fell somewhere much more chilling, an ordinary man spiraling into calculated depravity, covering up one mistake with another, clinging to illusions of control as his world collapsed around him. The game he played was not just with law enforcement or the victim's family. He was playing against the clock, against the limits of his own conscience, and ultimately against the inevitable exposure that would arrive through the smallest mistake. A smudge, a towel, a fingerprint left behind. Finally, John's nerve broke. Days after the last grisly trip to the dumpsters, a call from a friend asking about a missing freezer sent him spiraling. He cleaned the apartment with a frantic intensity, throwing away anything remotely incriminating. But his efforts could not account for the meticulous work of forensic investigators, the concerns of neighbors, or, most of all, the determination of Detective Garcia, whose piecing together of tiny clues mirrored John's own desperate need to hide them. The psychological toll of the ordeal left its mark on everyone involved. For the police, John's confessions and the subsequent searches laid bare the banality and horror of evil, a crime committed not by a monster from the shadows, but by a man who lived, worked, and laughed among them. For the community, the case shattered illusions of safety and trust. Friends and acquaintances who recalled John's calm, professional demeanor were forced to confront the dark uncertainties lurking behind ordinary facades. When, at last, the remains were fully traced and matched to Jessica, and the full scope of John's surgical, chilling actions became known, the city reeled. Public outrage reached new heights, and the details of his psychological games and grisly improvisation haunted all who heard them. The trial would focus on both the brutal physical evidence and the equally devastating story of how the mind of a man, cornered, brilliant, and desperate, could descend into such darkness, all hidden just beneath the rhythms of a city waking to another day. In retrospect, the path John carved was a warped reflection of urban isolation, a world where horror could be cooked, stored, and bagged beside tomorrow's groceries without anyone noticing until it was nearly too late. The truth revealed through fragments of evidence. There's a peculiar chill that settles over a crime lab when investigators sense they're standing in the eye of a human storm, one powered by relentless, haunted precision. For Detective Lori Garcia and her team, the breakthrough came not in one grand reveal, but in the slow, grueling accumulation of seemingly trivial fragments, each holding an unexpected power to illuminate the shadows John Carter worked so fiercely to maintain. In the days and weeks following John's confession, evidence from across Chicago was gathered, logged, and reconstructed in a task that felt more archaeological than criminal. Each piece, broken, stained, or scorched, demanded its share of time under the sterile, unforgiving bulbs of the forensic suite, as if begging to finally speak the truth, no matter how grotesque. The process was painstaking, but Garcia insisted on it. Nothing left unchecked, no shortcut forgiven. The first crucial find came when a maintenance worker in a quiet North Side apartment block discovered a suspicious-looking safe hid behind a false utility panel. The safe was heavy, caked with dust and paint, and locked with a combination no tenant admitted to owning. Police pried it open, and there, packed alongside dry rags and chemical packets, were fragments of a human skull, jawbone, and several discolored teeth. The forensic pathologist approached the grim find with steely resolve, yet even she hesitated. In decades of exposure to death, war, trauma, homicide, rarely had she seen remains so intentionally hidden, the final act of a perpetrator desperate to erase both identity and evidence. That wasn't all. Scraps of floral-patterned bath towels, identical to those found at the dump site, lined the bottom of the safe. DNA swabs were pulled, compared, and recompared. The jaw, with 2 faint fillings, was finally matched, painstakingly and irrefutably, to Jessica Tran. At last, the last incomplete piece of her story could be placed into the narrative. But the safe was only a chapter. Just as damning were the more covert clues, uncovered through days of slow police work. A pawn shop near Pilsen rang to declare they found a woman's gold ring with a faint J inscribed on the inner band, matched through old photos as Jessica's. The shopkeeper admitted without shame that it was pawned hastily by a man matching Carter's description, sweaty and nervous, with a story about paying off sudden debts. Cops played the security footage for the Trans. Mrs. Tran wept when she recognized her daughter's ring, a keepsake Jessica never took off since high school graduation. Specialists with portable blacklights returned to John's apartment for a second sweep, meticulously hunting for traces of blood missed during his original cleanup spree. It was easy to fool the average eye with bleach and industrial soap, but not Chicago PD's forensic team. Faint stains in the grout beneath the toilet. A thin trail down the kitchen drain, diluted but persistent. On the walls behind the bathtub, droplets that glowed under UV light. A tangible map of violence even after chemicals and scrubbing. Swabs were sent to the lab, and the results confirmed everyone's fear. Jessica's blood, in almost every room. Digital analysts played their role too. They rebuilt Carter's online life from tens of thousands of text fragments, deleted chats, and email metadata. The picture that emerged went beyond just motive and opportunity. There were deleted drafts, letters of apology, confessions never sent, and late-night browser searches chilling in their specificity. How long does it take for a body to decompose? Can DNA survive boiling? How to erase fingerprints? It was a grisly breadcrumb trail documenting not just John's desperation, but his futile hope that science could scrub away responsibility. Perhaps most unsettling was the pattern of acquisition revealed in hours of transaction logs and financial questioning. Receipts showed Carter buying duct tape, gloves, heavy-duty garbage bags, cleaning chemicals, and even a chest freezer from a local outlet, all within a 24-hour window of Jessica's disappearance. 2 clerks at different stores remembered him, harried, barely polite, with an edge of panic that seemed odd at the time, but made dreadful sense in retrospect. Another puzzle piece emerged through the hospital system, the discovery, in a shared laundry facility, of towels and rags permanently stained pink, despite multiple bleach cycles, crammed in the back of an industrial dryer. The towels matched the same budget brand as those wrapped around Jessica's remains. When DNA swabs came back, the connection was undeniable. The investigative narrative, when finally pieced together, was brutal in its clarity. Here was a suspect so fixated on erasure, on undoing what he'd done, that every step he took to cover his tracks only reinforced the certainty of his guilt. Even the criminal precision shown in disposing and cooking the remains left telltale traces: burnt fragments in the oven, chemical residue inside fridge seals, stray hair in a mop bucket. The emotional toll on the investigative team mounted as each new detail unspooled. CSI officers accustomed to blood, violence, and all manner of human darkness found themselves shaken, not just by the nature of Carter's efforts, but by the clinical, drawn-out desperation marking every attempt at concealment. In interviews, one forensics technician, himself a former combat medic, admitted he'd seen men hide their worst acts behind routine, but never with such brittle, calculated resolve. It haunted him. The way John rearranged daily life around a crime, doing laundry next to evidence, cooking and eating beside reminders of horror, as if sheer will and repetition could return things to normal. As the mountain of evidence swelled, Detective Garcia grew increasingly resolute. In briefing after briefing, she laid out the accumulating fragments, not just the obvious artifacts of violence, but the smaller, invisible links, the matching fibers stuck in trash bags, the identical cleaning agents in 2 different buildings, a smudged fingerprint pulled from the side of a broken knife handle. Each offered a means to connect the timeline, to show that Jessica's tragic journey, from her last text to Amy, to her final hours in Carter's apartment, could be reconstructed, all wishful thinking of ambiguity or reasonable doubt methodically swept away. Eventually, prosecution and defense came together at the pre-trial evidentiary hearing, where these grim trophies were paraded before a judge. The safe with the skull fragments, the ring reclaimed from the pawnshop, the fluorescent traces of blood, the torn, stained towels. Each expert, from DNA analysts to crime scene photographers, brought meticulous records, chain of custody ledgers, time-stamped files, magnified photographs capturing the horror in forensic detail. Through their testimony, what once felt like chaos coalesced into a singular, undeniable story. One person's desperate, doomed fight to erase a young woman from the world, and a community's parallel struggle to unmask that erasure and restore one last measure of justice. For the Tran family, the return of Jessica's few remaining personal effects represented a cruel catharsis. Mrs. Tran spent a whole evening cradling the gold ring that had traveled through the city's underbelly, tracing her daughter's initials and weeping for lost years. Mr. Tran attended the pre-trial proceedings, a silent pillar of grief, bearing witness to each item tagged and described. Each new fragment presented in court was another bitter reminder of the daughter the world allowed to disappear, but also an assertion that, in the end, even the most determined criminal cannot fully erase the truth. When the full evidence was presented at trial, the jury could see for themselves the overwhelming weight of fact. A story emerging not from confession alone, or from a single moment of revelation, but through the stubborn persistence of countless small details patiently assembled. It was forensic humility, as much as forensic science, that brought the truth into focus. The knowledge that every fragment, every flash of intuition, every tedious check and recheck played a part in defeating the darkness Carter wove around his crime. As the verdict loomed, Garcia felt a somber pride. She would think about this case for the rest of her career, not just because of the horror, but because of the small, hard proof that dedication in the face of cruelty can bring justice, peace, by blood-stained peace. The evidence, at long last, had spoken for Jessica Tran, louder than her killer's fear, and more indelibly than even the darkest secrets John Carter tried to keep. Consequences, and the final question for the reader. The Little Italy case did not simply end when the courtroom doors closed behind John Carter. In the aftermath of the verdict and his death sentence, waves of consequences continued to ripple outward. For the victim's family, the city's residents, law enforcement, and the wider public watching from their living rooms, the gruesome events left deep marks, sometimes visible, sometimes buried beneath the routines of daily life. For the Tran family, grief lingered in every corner of their home. Even with a name on the file and a sentence handed down, closure was far from complete. The image of Jessica's life, full of hope and promise, collided again and again with the shocking way she had been taken. There were nightmares, sleepless nights, and a new kind of silence that hovered over family meals and quiet moments. Mrs. Tran, once surrounded by her daughter's chatter, found herself lost in the echoes of absence, a kind of mourning that transformed with the seasons, but never really faded. Mr. Tran, who had worked so hard to piece together his daughter's last movements, now stared at old photos and wondered about all the small what-ifs that would stay unanswered. As weeks turned into months, the case's shadow extended over the Little Italy neighborhood, threatening the familiar comfort that had once been its greatest draw. Vendors and workers could not walk the back alleys without a jolt of memory. Parents grew more protective, glancing twice at missing person posters and the faces of customers they had always trusted. Businesses saw a dip in late-night traffic, and the hum of market routine was interrupted by sidelong glances and half-spoken rumors. The press did not shy away from the gory details, forcing every resident to live anew through the story of how violence and anonymity could twist together in the city's heart. Within the police department, the case left scars of its own. Detectives who had pored over evidence felt pride in their persistence, but also weariness. The details of the crime, remembered in grisly flashes, were carried home long after files were archived. Lori Garcia, hailed for her dogged pursuit of the truth, reported a sense of accomplishment mingled with disillusionment. The truth, she realized, could not mend the suffering left behind. The job of justice is never as simple as catching the criminal. There remain all the lives changed in the blast radius of one person's choices. The shock of the crime bled into conversations across the city and beyond. Social media buzzed with commentary, accusations, and anxious debates about the illusion of safety in urban life. People wrestled with questions of trust among neighbors, the invisibility of suffering, and the systemic failures that allow someone like Jessica to slip through society's cracks. There were calls for better support for young women living alone, debates about how thoroughly employers check up on missing staff, and renewed urgency around domestic violence resources and mental health care. The city government honored Jessica's memory with a plaque at the market, but most residents agreed. The real lesson lay in vigilance and empathy, not nostalgia. But perhaps the deepest consequence was psychological. The way the story forced everyone, those involved directly and those who merely watched from the sidelines, to confront uncomfortable realities about the world around them. John Carter was not a mythic monster lurking at the city's edge. He was a middle-class professional who navigated daily life with apparent normality. His crime was not the act of an obvious outcast, but of someone hiding darkness beneath routine, ambition, and charm. The case demanded that people ask themselves difficult, unanswerable questions. How well do we really know each other? Is anyone truly safe from harm, or from the capacity for cruelty, if pushed far enough? What warning signs do we miss in our rush toward comfort and distraction? How can communities create spaces where the lost and the suffering are noticed, not disregarded? In time, the newspapers moved on. New tragedies pushed the case off the front page. Jessica's photos were archived in the city's memory, and a new family occupied the apartment where her life ended so violently. But a residue lingered. The case left neighbors struggling to trust again, parents holding their children a little tighter, and police departments reviewing protocols for missing persons with a level of urgency and care long overdue. For some, the case was a call to action. Nonprofits and advocacy groups in Chicago redoubled their efforts to reach at-risk young people. Self-defense classes filled. Churches and cultural organizations organized support networks, pledging never to let another Jessica disappear without notice. For others, there was simply the slow, grueling work of healing. Therapy sessions, community vigils, and attempts at forgiveness, often more for oneself than for the criminal. And for the reader, now witness to the entire tapestry of this unbearable story, the real legacy of the case may lie in its challenge. Beyond the horror, beyond the forensic truth and the courtroom closure, remains a question that resists easy answers. In a crowded world full of movement, distractions, and digital distance, what does it mean to truly see one another? Will we recognize the signs of distress or danger, or retreat behind the comfort of ordinary explanations? It is easy to believe that such horror could never happen to us or in our own neighborhoods. It is easier still to think that evil must come cloaked as a stranger. But sometimes, the most troubling truth is that monsters do not rise from darkness. They hide behind ordinary doors, trusted uniforms, and polite smiles, only emerging when the city looks away. And in the end, the only shield a community has is the willingness to pay attention, to care for the invisible, and to ask hard questions, even when the answers unsettle or disturb. So, as you close Jessica Tran's story, fragmented, tragic, but now restored to memory, ask yourself, what would you do differently tomorrow if you knew that anyone could be lost and anyone could be found?